They say the sword fell in London, but the silence that followed reached all the way to Spain. It spread across the English Channel, over the courts of France, across the mountains of the Holy Roman Empire, and into the heart of the most powerful man in Europe, Charles V, emperor of half the known world. And in that silence lay a secret, one darker than vengeance, colder than hatred, and more strategic than any war he had ever fought. Imagine the moment. It is the morning of May 19th, 1536. The Tower of London glows pale beneath a gray sky. Soldiers line the courtyard. A small crowd gathers, nobles, servants, enemies, and those who have come for the spectacle of a queen's death. Anne Boleyn, once England's brightest flame, walks forward with her hands clasped, her step steady, her face serene. She kneels on the scaffold. She prays for the man who ordered her death.
She whispers forgiveness. A French swordsman lifts his blade. The steel flashes once, clean, swift, merciless, and Anne Boleyn's head falls. The crowd gasps. The queen is gone. But in Spain, in the towering halls of the Alcazar, in the mind of Charles V, there is no gasp. There is no outrage. There is only silence.
Why? Why did the emperor who fought ferociously for Catherine of Aragon say nothing when Anne Boleyn, Catherine's rival, yes, but also the Queen of England, was marched to her death? Why did the most powerful ruler in Europe refuse to intervene? Why did he allow Henry VIII to commit the most shocking act of his reign, to stain his throne with the blood of the woman he had once lifted to the heights of power? And what hidden truth did Charles understand that made him accept the fall of the woman who changed England forever? Today, we are uncovering the answers, the motives, the politics, the secrets behind the silence that killed a queen. But before we dive into the heart of this mystery, like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because history isn't only written in letters and battles. Sometimes it's written in silence and in the moments when even an emperor chooses not to speak. At first glance, Charles V's silence makes no sense. This is the same emperor who defended Catherine of Aragon, his aunt, with fire and fury. He pressured the Pope to deny Henry's annulment. He condemned the English court. He sent ambassadors to protect Catherine. He warned Henry of the consequences. He threatened diplomatic retaliation. He was Catherine's shield, her greatest protector. So why didn't he protect Anne Boleyn? Was it revenge? Was it satisfaction? Was it indifference? No. The truth is more complex, more strategic, and more devastating than any simple answer. Because Charles V, the man who defended Catherine with every weapon at his disposal, allowed Anne Boleyn to die not because he hated her, but because her death was a useful outcome. Anne was not a queen to him. She was not family. She was not an ally. She was not a political asset. Anne Boleyn was a symbol, a catalyst, and above all, a problem Henry VIII created for himself. A problem Charles V was more than happy to let England drown in. To understand why Anne was allowed to fall, we must step into the Europe of 1536, a continent on the verge of collapse. Religious wars brewed in Germany. The Ottoman Empire surged in Vienna. France remained a constant rival. Rome was struggling to maintain control. Scotland threatened rebellion. The Low Countries teetered with unrest. Charles V was not ruling an empire. He was balancing a powder keg. In the middle of this chaos, England had become a rogue state. Henry VIII had broken with Rome. He declared himself head of the Church of England. He humiliated Catherine of Aragon. He remarried without papal approval. He executed bishops. He seized monasteries. He defied the Catholic world. And the woman at the heart of all of this? Anne Boleyn. To Charles, she was not simply Henry's second wife. She was the spark that ignited the English Reformation. She was the face of Protestant rebellion. She was the symbol of defiance against Rome. She was the reason Catherine died in disgrace. But she was also the reason Henry had isolated himself. If Anne rose, England rose with her. If Anne fell, England fell deeper into instability. And instability in England was good news for Charles V. When Charles V heard of Anne's arrest, he immediately recognized the implications. Henry was destroying the woman he had torn Europe apart to marry. He was executing the queen who justified the break with Rome. He was turning the Reformation into a circus. He was proving himself to be emotional, erratic, and politically incompetent. And Charles, watching from a distance, saw the perfect opportunity. By doing nothing, by refusing to defend her, by refusing to interfere, he allowed Henry to humiliate himself on the world stage. Anne's death weakened the Protestant cause. Anne's death undermined Henry's legitimacy. Anne's death vindicated Catherine's stance. Anne's death exposed England's instability. Anne's death strengthened the Catholic world. And Charles V gained all of this without lifting a sword. It was the most powerful political maneuver a ruler could make. Let your enemy destroy himself. The darkest truth of all is this. Anne Boleyn died not because Henry VIII hated her, not because Cromwell turned against her, not because jealous courtiers plotted her downfall, but because when the tides turned, she had no one powerful enough to save her. Catherine had Spain. Jane Seymour had new allies. Catherine Howard had the Howards. Catherine Parr had Protestant supporters. Anne had Henry, and when Henry withdrew his protection, she had no army, no nation, no emperor. A queen without a kingdom is already dead. And Charles V, the man with the power to stop the execution with a single letter, saw no political value in defending her. His silence was the final verdict.
Anne Boleyn's fall did not unfold in the shadows. It unfolded under the watchful eyes of Europe, courts whispering, dukes calculating, ambassadors scribbling letters with trembling hands. And among all these observers, no gaze was sharper, colder, or more quietly influential than that of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. When Anne was arrested, Europe didn't erupt. It paused. Not because the accusations were believable, but because everyone, friends, enemies, allies, rivals, was waiting to see what the emperor would do. He did nothing. And that nothing was more devastating than any army he could have sent. To understand how chilling this silence was, we must look through the eyes of the man who reported every detail to Charles V, Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador in England. Chapuis despised Anne Boleyn. His letters dripped with disdain. He called her the concubine, with the casual cruelty of a man who believed Anne's rise was a personal insult to his queen, Catherine of Aragon. And yet, when the charges against Anne were revealed, adultery, treason, incest, even Chapuis faltered. In one letter, he confessed that the evidence was slender, that the accusations seemed staged, that the men arrested with her looked more like sacrifices than traitors. Coming from Chapuis, this was not a pity. This was recognition. A reluctant acknowledgement that the hunt was rigged, that Anne Boleyn was being destroyed not by justice, but by orchestration. It is one thing to be condemned by an enemy. It is another to be condemned even as that enemy openly admits you have been framed. And Charles V received every one of these letters. He knew Anne's guilt was questionable. He knew the trial was engineered. He knew the execution was prearranged. Yet still, silence. At first, the emperor's silence seems cruel, but cruelty alone cannot explain it.
Charles V was not an impulsive man, and he was not driven by hatred so shallow that it could justify letting a queen die unjustly. His motives were colder, more strategic, more imperial. For Catherine of Aragon, the situation had been entirely different. Catherine was family, a Spanish princess, a daughter of the great Catholic dynasty. Her humiliation was an insult to Charles himself. Her exile reflected on the honor of Spain. Defending her was defending his own bloodline. But Anne Boleyn? Anne was a French-leaning Protestant queen, a queen whose rise had fractured Christendom, a queen whose influence had dragged England into rebellion against Rome. Catherine strengthened the emperor's world. Anne disrupted it. Catherine had nations fighting for her dignity.
Anne had no kingdom willing to lift a finger, and in the ruthless logic of Renaissance diplomacy, a queen without powerful allies is a queen already dead.
Anne Boleyn was no ordinary queen. She represented a movement, a religious and political upheaval that threatened the entire Catholic order. It was her presence beside Henry that emboldened England to break from Rome. It was her influence that encouraged the rise of Protestant voices in court. It was her marriage that turned England from a Catholic kingdom into a rebel state. Every breath she took symbolized a challenge to the emperor's vision of a unified Christendom. And yet, the moment Henry turned on her, the moment her star began to fall, Anne suddenly represented something very different. Proof of Henry's instability. Her downfall made the English Reformation look less like a glorious cause and more like a chaotic extension of Henry's passions. If Henry could destroy the woman he broke with Rome to marry, then his religious rebellion looked ridiculous, arbitrary, childish, politically suicidal. In allowing Anne to die, Charles allowed England to make a fool of itself. He didn't have to raise a sword. All he had to do was let Henry swing his own. While England braced for the shock of its queen's execution, the emperor understood a deeper truth. Every blow Henry struck at Anne was a blow to his own prestige. Every rumor Henry allowed to spread corroded his legitimacy. Every lie Cromwell manufactured made England look less stable, less Catholic, less trustworthy. Charles V had spent years trying to contain the wildfire of the Reformation, and suddenly Henry was handing him a miracle. A Reformation queen killed by the very king who worshipped her. A kingdom tearing itself apart. A monarch ridiculed for his emotional chaos. A faction of Protestant reformers losing their most dazzling icon. Why interrupt such a perfect storm? Why save a queen whose survival stabilized England when her death destabilized it? For an emperor juggling wars against France, rebellions in the Low Countries, and the threat of Ottoman invasion, England's internal collapse was an unexpected gift. Charles V understood something terrifying. Once Henry VIII stopped protecting Anne, no one else would. She had no country behind her, no great family, no empire, no pope, no army, no ally strong enough to risk a diplomatic crisis. Anne Boleyn's crown glittered, but beneath it she was utterly alone. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, stayed silent. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, distanced himself. Her brother was imprisoned beside her. Her political allies were torn down with her. She had risen through Henry's passion, and now she drowned in it. And Charles, watching from afar, saw no reason to intervene. Not out of hatred, not out of vengeance, but because the fall of Anne Boleyn strengthened the world he wanted to protect. Her survival offered him nothing. Her death offered him everything. In the royal courts of Europe, queens survived through their power to bring alliances. Catherine brought Spain.
Jane Seymour brought internal peace. Catherine Parr brought Protestant influence. But Anne brought no shield, no foreign protection, no powerful king with a personal stake in her survival. She was the most vulnerable kind of queen, a queen whose only defender was the king who ordered her death. Charles V did not need to fight her. France did not need to save her. Rome did not need to absolve her. Her fate had already been sealed the moment Henry withdrew his love. A queen with no champion is already a corpse waiting for the sword. Anne Boleyn's final days unfolded like a slow eclipse. The world she once commanded, the court that trembled at her smile, the nobles who bent their knees when she entered, now watched her with a terrible stillness, as if her fall was not the murder of a queen, but the extinguishing of a problem. It is one of the cruelties of history that the moments before her death were marked not by rage, but by clarity. Locked in the Tower of London, she understood what most queens of her age never admitted, that power without allies is nothing, that crowns are only as strong as the men willing to defend them, and that her final breath would pass through a world that had already decided she was finished. Witnesses later wrote that she prayed more calmly than anyone had expected. She wept for her daughter, she forgave her accusers, and she insisted until the end that she had never betrayed her king. But beneath the prayers, beneath the poise, beneath the final flicker of hope, Anne carried a knowledge far more painful than death. She had been abandoned not only by Henry, but by the entire architecture of international power. No royal envoy arrived with demands of mercy. No desperate letter came pleading for her life. No threats from foreign kings disturbed the English court. The woman who once set Europe ablaze now vanished without a single ripple from beyond England's borders. And the silence that surrounded her execution had one unmistakable source: the emperor who refused to intervene. On the morning of her execution, Anne walked out into the pale light of the Tower Green alone. Her enemies lined the edges of the courtyard. Her allies were either imprisoned or pretending not to know her. Even her father, Thomas Boleyn, remained conspicuously absent, a man folding in on himself to preserve what little dignity he still possessed. When she knelt, the wind lifted the ribbons of her gown like a final, fragile salute. Her lips moved in prayer. Her hands trembled only once. And then the French swordsman, chosen for his precision, chosen so that Anne's death would be quick, chosen so that no divine mistake would humiliate Henry, did his work. One stroke, one breath, one queen gone. But the echoes of her fall did not stop at the tower walls. In Spain, they were heard as vindication. In Rome, as an opportunity. In France, as a tragedy mixed with satisfaction. And in the empire of Charles V, as the quiet victory that comes from letting an enemy falter on his own blade. Anne's death weakened Henry. It fractured the Reformation's unity. It exposed the volatility of the English court. It stripped away the illusion that Henry's new marriage and new church rested on strength. Charles watched this unfold with the same calm precision that Henry had once admired Anne herself. He did not need to speak. He did not need to act. He did not need to send a single army or ambassador. Henry had done exactly what Charles needed him to do: discredit himself. It is tempting to imagine Charles as a villain in this story, cold, calculating, heartless. Yet in the logic of kingship, he was not acting out of cruelty but necessity. He governed lands stretching from Austria to Spain, from Italy to the New World. He fought wars against France, rebellions in the Low Countries, and the terrifying advance of the Ottoman Empire. Saving Anne Boleyn would have offered him nothing except another needless conflict.
Letting her die, however, allowed England to sink deeper into its own internal storms. An unstable Henry VIII was easier to contain. A discredited English Reformation was easier to undermine. A mourning nation was easier to sway. And so Charles V chose the path that served the empire. He let silence do the work of swords. But there is a darker layer beneath the political strategy. Anne was not simply a political threat to Catholic unity. She was a personal reminder of the suffering Catherine of Aragon endured. Even if Charles did not hate Anne, he could not forget that her rise meant Catherine's humiliation. In the chessboard of kings, emotion may not dictate moves, but it whispers in the ear of strategy. And in 1536, the whisper told Charles that England needed reckoning more than Anne needed mercy.
Anne Boleyn's story should have ended on the scaffold. But history, that unpredictable, poetic force, had other plans. Her daughter survived, against all odds, against Henry's disappointment, against courtly whispers that she was the daughter of a whore. The child whose mother died abandoned became England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I. And here lies the twist so sharp it borders on cosmic irony. The emperor who let Anne Boleyn die lived to see the rise of her daughter, a queen whose Protestant reign shattered the Catholic dreams he had built his life upon. Anne's absence freed the very future Charles feared. Anne's death strengthened the child who would define England. Anne's execution marked the beginning of a reign that would challenge Spain's power, destroy the Armada, and forever alter Europe's balance. Charles's silence did not end Anne Boleyn's influence.
It magnified it. He allowed her to die, but he could not stop the shadow she cast across the century. If Charles V had intervened, would Anne Boleyn have lived long enough to see her daughter grow? Would the English Reformation have changed shape? Would Henry have dared to execute a queen if an emperor demanded restraint? And more haunting still, would Elizabeth have become the woman she did if her mother had not died? Anne's execution forged Elizabeth's destiny. It carved out a childhood shaped by exile, caution, and defiance. It taught her that crowns can fall with a whisper, that kings can lie, that loyalty is fragile, and that women with power walk a knife's edge. Perhaps Charles's silence was not merely a political act, but the spark that created the Elizabethan age. So why did Charles V accept the death of Anne Boleyn? Because her fall protected his empire. Because her death weakened his enemies. Because her survival offered him nothing. Because even innocence cannot outweigh the needs of nations. Anne Boleyn died not due to guilt, but because she stood alone. She died because the world found value not in saving her, but in watching what her death would unravel. In the end, the emperor's silence was not the absence of action. It was the action. If this story made you see Anne Boleyn differently, or made you question the choices of kings and emperors, tell us in the comments. Was Charles V justified in letting her die, or was his silence the greatest betrayal of all? And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Crowns, and join us next time as we uncover the hidden truths behind the thrones that shaped the world.